The wind on the island of Eilean Moor did not howl, it grated, like the rusty teeth of a giant gnawing on the bones of the earth. On the 13th of December, 1900, the silence here was louder than any storm. Inside the stone tower of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, the air had frozen, saturated with the scent of cooled stew and stale tobacco. On the wooden table in the center of the room stood a plate of untouched potatoes, and next to it lay an overturned chair, as if its owner had jumped up in terror or haste. The clock on the wall had stopped, its pendulum frozen at a dead point, marking the end of time for those who had lived there. Dust danced in the single beam of light piercing through the thick glass of the lantern room, illuminating particles that seemed too heavy for the air. They settled slowly, like ash after a fire, covering the table's surface with a thin gray layer. This light was cold and lifeless, it did not warm, but only revealed the details of abandonment. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed thicker than usual, appearing to congeal as they watched the emptiness. The silence pressed against the eardrums, creating an illusion of a high, piercing ring that drove mad those who stayed here too long. The stone walls, several feet thick, usually served as reliable protection against the fury of the Atlantic, but on that day, they seemed as thin as paper. Through them seeped not cold, but something else, ancient and alien to human understanding. The smell of food, once appetizing and homely, now induced nausea. It mixed with the metallic taste of fear, which settled on the tongue as a bitter film. The plate of food looked like a still life painted by a mad artist, where every object was in its place, yet the entire composition screamed of a violation of the natural order. A fork lay parallel to the edge of the table, a knife at an angle, creating a geometric pattern that seemed ritualistic, deliberate. Not a crumb had fallen to the floor, not a drop of sauce had spilled. This was not a flight, but an interruption. A moment when life stopped not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had severed the thread of reality. The surrounding landscape outside the windows was gray and monolithic, the cliffs merging with the sky into a single canvas of hopelessness. The horizon had vanished, erasing the boundaries between land and water, between safety and doom. The sea below did not churn, it lay flat and dark, like a black mirror reflecting the void of the heavens. Not a single white strip of surf, not a single splash, only a dead smoothness that frightened more than the highest waves. This unnatural calm of the water contradicted everything sailors knew about these latitudes, where the ocean was always in motion, always hungry and vicious. The water seemed viscous, almost solid, ready to absorb any sound, any trace of existence. It waited, holding its breath in its depths, keeping secrets that were better left unrevealed. The silence inside the tower resonated with this external immobility, creating a vacuum in which the sounds of one's own breathing seemed deafening. Every inhale sounded like betrayal, every heartbeat like a countdown to an inevitable end. The overturned chair was the only evidence of movement, the final act of life in this frozen world. Its legs, pointing toward the ceiling, resembled the limbs of an insect crushed by an invisible force. The wood of the chair was old, worn smooth by the hands of those who had sat on it for years, watching the horizon. Now it lay as a useless piece of material, a symbol of interrupted domesticity. No one knew who had knocked it over. Was it an act of despair, an attempt to flee, or a reaction to something impossible to see with the eye? The air in the room had become heavy, saturated with electricity that tingled the skin and made the hair on one's arms stand on end. The lamp on the table still burned, its wick dying out, emitting acrid smoke that coiled under the ceiling, forming whimsical shapes. These shapes resembled faces distorted by screams, or hands reaching for the light. In the corner of the room hung the keeper's jackets. One of them was missing. The hook on which it should have hung swayed almost imperceptibly, although there was no draft. This movement was barely perceptible, but it destroyed the illusion of stasis, reminding one that time here had not stopped, but had become distorted. The other two jackets hung heavily, filled with moisture and salt, as if the bodies of those who wore them were still inside, awaiting their hour. The fabric was stiff to the touch, soaked in sweat and sea mist, preserving the scent of bodies that would never return. The duty log lay open on the edge of the table, its pages trembling from the invisible breath of the house. The ink on the last entry was smudged, as if the writer's hand had faltered at the moment of catastrophe. The words were illegible, turned into chaotic scribbles that could not be read but could be felt. They conveyed terror, pure and primal, which needs no words for understanding. The paper was damp, not from water, but from something sticky and warm that had dried, leaving behind yellow stains. These stains expanded like living organisms, consuming the text, erasing the history of 3 men who had become part of legend. The lighthouse continued to stand, unshakable and indifferent, its lens rotating with mechanical precision, sending signals into the void. The light snatched pieces of rock and water from the darkness, but it could not illuminate the cause of the disappearance. It only emphasized the loneliness of the place, cut off from the world not only by distance but by the very nature of reality. Here, the laws of physics gave way to the laws of fear, and logic dissolved in the fog of the unknown. James Ducat, the principal keeper, was a man of order, whose life obeyed the rhythm of the rotating Fresnel lens. His existence was measured not by hours or days, but by the revolutions of the mechanism that sliced through the darkness with its all-seeing eye. He knew every creak of the gears, every shade of light passing through the prisms, and every shadow cast upon the tower walls. His hands, roughened by salt and wind, meticulously maintained the logbook, recording every change in pressure and wind direction with the pedantic precision of a scientist. But in recent days, his handwriting had changed, becoming jagged and illegible. The letters, once neat and clear, now resembled spasms captured in ink on paper. The lines danced, overlapping each other as if trying to escape the meaning they carried. Ducat wrote of a storm that did not exist, of waves rising higher than the highest point of the cliff, although the sky remained piercingly blue and cloudless. He described the roar of the ocean, which drowned out thoughts, although in reality, a dead, ringing silence prevailed. Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur watched him with growing anxiety, feeling reality around them begin to crack at the seams. They saw their senior colleague sinking into a world inaccessible to their understanding, a world where the boundaries between the visible and the invisible were erased. Marshall, young and impressionable, often caught Ducat's gaze, filled with horror and recognition, as if the chief keeper saw something in him hidden from the others. This gaze chilled the blood, forcing the young man to lower his eyes and pretend to be busy polishing brass. MacArthur, a more practical and cynical man, tried to attribute Ducat's behavior to fatigue and isolation. He claimed that a long watch in solitude could drive anyone mad, even the strongest of spirit. But deep down, he felt it was not about fatigue. The air in the tower had become heavy, saturated with static electricity that tingled the skin and made the hair on one's arms stand on end. The smell of ozone mixed with the scent of old oil and tobacco, creating an atmosphere of an impending storm that was not in the sky. The duty log lay on the table like an accusation. The pages, written by Ducat's hand, breathed madness. He described creatures crawling out of the foam, shadows moving against the wind, and voices calling them by name from the depths of the ocean. These entries were not just delirium, they were a map of the nightmare unfolding right beneath their feet. Marshall secretly read these lines when Ducat went up to the rotation mechanism. Every word pierced his consciousness like a splinter that could not be removed. One night, Marshall woke to the sound of footsteps on the outer gallery. The steps were heavy, measured, as if someone was pacing back and forth, guarding the entrance. He looked out the window and saw Ducat's figure standing at the very edge of the parapet. The chief keeper was not looking at the sea, but up, into the black sky, his face distorted by a grimace of ecstasy or pain. The wind tore at his clothes, but he stood motionless, as if rooted to the stone. Marshall wanted to call out to him, but his voice stuck in his throat, constricted by an invisible hand. When dawn finally broke through the gray veil of fog, Ducat returned inside. His face was pale, his eyes feverishly bright. He said not a word, merely walked to the table and continued writing in the log.
The figures don't add up,
His hand
Robert.
moved quickly,
You know they
aggressively, scratching the paper with the pen.
I'm telling you, this is
The
the
ink
only
was
way.
running out, but he did not stop, squeezing the last drops from the nib, leaving pale, almost transparent traces on the page. Marshall and MacArthur exchanged glances, their eyes reading a silent question: who was this person who had taken their boss's place? MacArthur tried to talk to Duckett, asking about the weather, the condition of the mechanisms, about anything that could bring them back to reality. But Duckett looked at him with an empty gaze, as if through him, and whispered something about the sea being hungry. His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable, as if his throat had been rubbed with sand. He spoke of duty, of the price to be paid for the light, and that the bill had come. These words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, like a stone thrown into a well. In the following days, the atmosphere in the tower became unbearable. Silence was no longer just the absence of sound, it had become the presence of something alive, watching them. Every creak of the floorboards, every click of the mechanism was perceived as a signal, a warning. The keepers stopped sleeping, afraid to close their eyes, fearing what they might see in their dreams. They sat in the common room, staring at the fire in the fireplace, which barely warmed them despite the hot flames. Duckett stopped eating. He only drank water, greedily, in large gulps, as if trying to quench a thirst that could not be satisfied. His body wasted away before their eyes, skin stretching over bones, making him look like a skeleton wrapped in parchment. But in this emaciation lay a strange, perverted strength. He moved quickly, sharply, his reactions becoming supernatural. He could catch a falling cup without looking, or hear a whisper behind a closed door. Marshall noticed that the clocks in the tower had begun to run unevenly. Sometimes they sped up, sometimes they lagged, and sometimes the hands froze, trembling in place. This coincided with the moments when Duckett entered the room. It seemed that time itself distorted in his presence, submitting to his will or his madness. The young keeper began to believe that Duckett had not gone mad, but had discovered something that should have remained hidden. Something ancient that slept in the depths of the ocean and was now awakening. MacArthur, losing his patience, suggested going down to the boat and trying to send a distress signal, despite the calm. But Duckett forbade them from leaving the tower. His voice sounded like an order, not subject to discussion. He stated that going outside was tantamount to death, that the sea awaited them below, ready to absorb anyone who dared to step on the wet stones. His eyes burned with fanatical fire, and at that moment, both junior keepers realized they were prisoners not of circumstances, but of a man who had lost touch with humanity. On the evening of the 12th of December, Duckett burned several pages of the log. The flame devoured the paper, turning words into ash, but the smell of burning ink remained in the air, acrid and sweetish. He watched the fire with an expression of relief, as if getting rid of a burden that weighed on his soul. But Marshall managed to notice one word before it disappeared into the fire. That word was, they. And in this plural form lay a horror surpassing any fear of loneliness or the elements. Thomas Marshall, young and superstitious, was the first to notice the strangeness in the behavior of the sea. He stood at the kitchen window, peering into the gray distance where the horizon should have met the water. But the line of surf had vanished. The water at the base of the lighthouse did not recede as the laws of tides dictated, but seemed to be sucked into the black bowels of the island. It was an unnatural sight, violating every rule known to sailors. The ocean level dropped too quickly, exposing the seabed that should never have seen the light. Slippery, algae-covered stones emerged from the dark depths like the ribs of a giant beast. They glistened under the dim daylight, coated in slime that seemed alive. Marshall felt cold creep up his spine as he watched these exposed sections of rock. Usually, they were hidden beneath churning foam, inaccessible to the human eye. Now they lay open and vulnerable, inviting someone or something to climb up. The water made no sound, it withdrew silently, like blood from a wound, leaving behind the smell of rot and silt. Donald MacArthur, an experienced fisherman, refused to step out onto the outer gallery. His hands, which knew the weight of nets and the tremor of a catch, trembled when he approached the heavy iron door. He claimed to hear footsteps atop the tower, although no one was there. The sound was clear and rhythmic, as if someone paced along the metal grating of the walkway. But the wind could not make such sounds, and rats could not tread so heavily. This was the gait of a person, or a creature wearing their form, waiting outside. They found Duckett's jacket hanging on the hook in the hallway, although by regulation it should have been on him during any outdoor work. The heavy woolen fabric still retained the warmth of a body, as if the owner had just taken it off. This simple fact violated all safety protocols and sowed seeds of panic in their souls. The chief keeper had never allowed such negligence. His discipline was legendary, and now his clothing hung there like an empty shell, testifying that he had gone outside without protection from the elements. Marshall touched the sleeve of the jacket, and his fingers felt the damp salt ground into the fibers. But the smell was not merely of the sea. The fabric carried something ancient, reminiscent of deep caves or sealed tombs. It was the smell of time that had frozen and begun to decay. MacArthur stood nearby, clutching a lantern, ready to strike into the darkness at any moment. They understood they were trapped. The door was closed, but the lock had not been turned from the inside. Someone had gone out and not returned, leaving them alone with the silence. The wind outside the window intensified, but the sound did not match the movement of air. It was a grating noise, like metal scraping against stone. Marshall approached the window again and saw the water beginning to return. But it did not surge in waves, it rose as a single wall, black and dense. It concealed the exposed rocks as quickly as if they had never existed. The speed of the rising water was dangerous, threatening to flood the base of the tower within minutes. Nature around the lighthouse had gone mad, ignoring the laws of physics and logic. MacArthur tried to speak about the need to check the rotation mechanism, but his voice cracked. The room grew dark, although the day was not yet over. Shadows lengthened, stretching toward them from the corners like living tendrils. They felt the presence of a third person, although Duckett was absent. His absence was more palpable than any presence. The air thickened, it became hard to breathe, as if oxygen were being burned away by an invisible fire. They stood in the center of the room, two people against an inexplicable horror, flinching at every creak of wood. The log on the table lay closed, but it seemed to pulse. Inside were words that could not be spoken aloud. Marshall knew that if they opened it now, they would see their fate. But fear of the unknown was stronger than curiosity. They decided to wait for night, hoping that dawn would bring relief. However, the sun was already setting, staining the sky the color of clotted blood. Time flowed incorrectly, minutes stretched into hours, and hours compressed into moments. Duckett's jacket continued to hang on the hook, swaying without wind. Its empty sleeves resembled the limbs of a hanged man. MacArthur turned away, unable to look at this silent piece of evidence. He knew he should put on his own jacket and go out to check the perimeter, but his legs would not obey. The instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to run. The island was cut off from the world by an ocean that now behaved like a predator. They were locked in a stone jar, watched by something outside. The arrival of night brought not just darkness, but a thick, tangible blackness. It seeped through the glass, filling the room with black fog. The lamp on the table burned dimly, its light unable to pierce the gloom. Marshall and MacArthur sat back to back, guarding each other from the invisible threat. They knew Duckett would not return. Something had taken him, and now that something stood behind the door, waiting for an invitation to enter. The silence became absolute, and in that silence, madness was born. The night before the disappearance dropped a heavy blanket of darkness over the island, impenetrable even to the lighthouse beam. The light of the Fresnel lens sliced through the gloom, but it seemed the darkness swallowed it, not allowing it to penetrate beyond a few yards. The air became viscous, as if soaked in oil, hindering every movement and making breathing shallow. Inside the tower, shadows lengthened, stretching from the corners like black fingers trying to feel for the living flesh of the inhabitants. Silence was no longer emptiness, it filled with expectation, heavy and foreboding. Every sound inside the stone walls amplified multiple times, turning into a threat. The creak of wood sounded like the step of an uninvited guest, and the rustle of paper resembled the whisper of conspirators. It seemed the island itself held its breath, awaiting a sacrifice. The entries in the log became incoherent, full of mentions of shadows moving against the wind. Duckett's handwriting turned into chaotic scratches, the ink soaked through in places as if drops of sweat had fallen on the pages. He described sounds resembling human weeping coming from the depths of the ocean. These sounds were not wind or cries of gulls, they had the intonation of pain and demand. The words on paper breathed horror that could not be expressed in ordinary language. Marshall read these lines by the lamplight, and the letters danced before his eyes, folding into curses. Each entry was a cry for help that no one could hear beyond the island. The pages stuck together, as if soaked not with ink, but with something thicker. Duckett stopped sleeping, his eyes sunken, and his skin acquired the gray shade of a dead man. He wandered the tower like a ghost, not touching the floor with his feet. His movements became jerky, devoid of human smoothness. It seemed something inside him had burned out, leaving only a shell controlled by an external force. He did not react to touch, his gaze directed through the walls into some other dimension. Cold emanated from him, despite the hot stove. Marshall and MacArthur felt this cold, penetrating under clothing, chilling the blood. They ceased to recognize in him the man who had led them just a week ago. His hands trembled, fingers curled as if he constantly clenched an invisible object. He stood for hours at the window, peering into the void where, according to him, a storm was gathering capable of washing away the earth itself. Outside the glass there was nothing but a calm sea and a starry sky. But Duckett saw otherwise. His pupils expanded, absorbing the iris, his face distorted by a grimace of silent scream. He pointed with a trembling hand at the horizon where the air shimmered like over hot asphalt. For others there was only the smooth water, but for him walls of water higher than the tower were rising there. He saw monsters in the foam and demons in the clouds. His mind split under the pressure of what only his eyes saw. Reality for him divided into two parts, what was, and what was approaching. Marshall and MacArthur tried to calm him, but their words drowned in the rising hum that only the senior keeper heard. This hum started low, vibrating in the floor, then rose higher, penetrating into bones. It was not sound in the ordinary understanding, it was a vibration of reality itself. Duckett covered his ears, but it did not help. The sound came from inside his head, or from the depths of the earth under the foundation. The junior keepers stood nearby, feeling only a slight trembling of the glass in the frames. For them the world remained solid, but for Duckett it turned into liquid ready to swallow them all. The hum grew, becoming unbearable, pressing on eyeballs and making teeth clench in spasm. At some point Duckett turned to them, and nothing human remained in his gaze. It was the look of a creature that had made a decision. He slowly walked to the table and closed the log. The click of the clasp sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the room. He took off his jacket and carefully hung it on the hook, although he was about to go outside. This action was the last act of normality before the abyss. He looked at the door leading to the gallery, and his lips moved without sound. Marshall understood that he was going to meet what he feared most. Resistance was useless, fate already written in the ink of madness. In this gesture was the finality of death. The hum intensified, turning into a roar that shook the stone walls of the tower. The lamp on the table wavered, the flame stretched into a thin needle ready to go out. Shadows on the walls darted, detaching from the objects that cast them. Duckett opened the door, and air smelling of ozone and ancient water rushed inside. He stepped over the threshold without looking back. Marshall and MacArthur froze, paralyzed by fear. They knew that if they followed him, they would disappear too. The door slammed shut by itself, cutting them off from the senior companion. They remained alone in the silence, which now seemed louder than any storm. Behind the door there were no steps, only the sound of receding water. The morning of the 14th of December arrived quietly and treacherously calm, as if nature decided to hold its breath before the final act of tragedy. The sun rose over the horizon, staining the sky in pale tones of dead mother-of-pearl, devoid of any hope for warmth. The wind subsided, leaving behind only a ringing emptiness that seemed heavier than any storm that had raged here before. The island lay in waiting, like a beast holding its breath, ready to leap or die. The stone tower of the lighthouse rose above the cliffs like a tombstone, a silent testament to a night that no living creature had survived. The beam's light extinguished with dawn, the mechanism stopped, and now silence belonged only to the cold stone and black water. Not a single bird circled over the peak, not a single sound disturbed the peace of this God-forgotten place in the ocean. The air was cold and clean, devoid of the smell of life, breath, or fire. Inside the living quarters reigned a disorder that screamed of the suddenness of what had happened, leaving no doubt about catastrophe. The table was set for breakfast, but the meal never began, frozen in anticipation of guests who would never come. The teapot had cooled, metal covered with condensation, as if with tears of grief for the departed masters of the house. The bread had gone stale, its crust hard as stone, unfit for eating, a symbol of interrupted sustenance. Pieces of food remained on the plates, now covered with a film, disgusting to look at and smell. This was a frozen moment of daily life, interrupted at the most interesting point by the hand of an invisible predator. A knife lay next to the butter, a spoon drowned in an empty cup, creating a still life of death. Every object was in its place, but together they composed a picture of complete catastrophe. The smell of cooled tea mixed with the smell of dampness penetrating through the thick walls. Marshall's chair lay on its side, as if knocked over by a sudden movement full of despair or mortal terror. Wooden legs scratched the floor, leaving marks that seemed fresh, as if the event had just occurred. This was not a fall from carelessness or an accidental elbow bump. In this gesture one could read panic or a sudden impulse to flee from an invisible threat. Someone had jumped up so quickly that balance was lost instantly, with no chance to recover. The shadow of the overturned chair stretched across the floor, pointing to the door as the source of danger. It seemed that the chair's owner saw something there, beyond the threshold, that made him forget everything else in the world. The wood of the chair was cold to the touch, having absorbed the horror of the last moment of a person's life. This simple piece of furniture became the main witness to the disappearance of 3 souls. MacArthur's jacket was absent from its usual place, although he never went outside without it in such weather. The hook gaped with emptiness, lonely and useless, like a severed finger on a hand. An experienced sailor knew the value of warmth and protection from the elements, especially in northern waters in winter. Going out without outerwear in December off the Scottish coast was tantamount to voluntary suicide. This violated all survival logic, all instructions and safety rules of the service. Either he left in haste, not thinking about the cold, or he was dragged out by force, not given odds. The emptiness on the hook weighed heavier than the jacket itself, pressing on consciousness. It spoke of the body being outside, exposed to wind and waves, or that the jacket was needed by someone else. The door to the outer gallery stood wide open, letting inside the cold salty air that froze everything living. The hinges creaked from the draft, the sound echoing in the empty tower like a gunshot in the silence of a temple. Wind wandered through the room, turning pages of books and extinguishing candles left burning through the night. The threshold was open to everything outside, no protection, no barriers between man and the abyss. The darkness of the corridor led directly to daylight, but this light brought no warmth, only cold. The air inside smelled of ocean, seaweed, and something metallic, resembling blood. It seemed that death itself had entered through this door and taken those who had lived here for long years. The door beat against the wall in the rhythm of a heart that had stopped beating forever. Inside the tower there were no signs of struggle, no bloodstains, no indications that 3 people could have left this place of their own will. The floor was clean, as if washed before departure, erasing all evidence of human presence. The staircase led upward to the lantern room, but no one was there, only emptiness and dust. The rotation mechanism stood motionless, gears frozen in oil, ceasing their eternal motion. There was no note, no explanations, no farewell words, no plea for help. Only emptiness, ringing in the ears, pressed on the mind harder than any noise. The walls seemed thicker than yesterday, closing space into a trap with no exit. Every corner kept a secret that could not be solved by the human mind. The absence of bodies was more terrifying than their presence, than the sight of death. Time in the tower stopped along with the people, frozen at the point of no return, marked by the last glance at the sea. The clock on the wall was silent, its pendulum frozen, counting eternity instead of seconds. Dust settled on surfaces, preserving the moment of disappearance, like a museum exhibit of catastrophe. It seemed that if one touched the objects, one could feel the warmth of departed hands, but everything was icy. Cold penetrated under clothing, into bones, into the soul, freezing feelings. This was the cold of absence, a vacuum left after the disappearance of matter. 3 lives dissolved into air, leaving no trace, no memory. The lighthouse stood as a monument to the unknown, a silent question to the heavens. The ocean outside continued to breathe, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred on its shore. Daylight penetrated through windows, highlighting details of the interior, making them sharp and tangible in this surreal picture. Shadows lay incorrectly, distorted by the angle of falling rays, creating an illusion of movement where there was none. Dust particles danced in beams, the only movement in this dead world, frozen in time. A book on the table lay open in the middle, a page dog-eared, reading interrupted mid-sentence. A pipe had burned out in the ashtray, tobacco turned to grey powder, cold and lifeless. Life had been here, and suddenly it was gone, evaporated without reason. The boundary between existence and non-existence proved thinner than paper, thinner than breath. No one heard the cry, no one saw the moment of departure, only the result remained. The feeling of something alien's presence did not leave the space, pressing on shoulders with invisible weight. It seemed that someone invisible stood behind one's back, watching, waiting for a mistake. The air vibrated from unspoken words, from cries that were never uttered. Walls pressed inward, narrowing space, turning the tower into a coffin for the living. Surviving here became impossible, air became poison for lungs. The spirits of the place demanded sacrifice, and they received it in full, without remainder. 3 people became payment for the calm of sea routes, a coin in the hands of fate. Their names faded from the memory of the living, remaining only in official archive reports. But the tower remembered every step, every breath, every moment of horror. Silence became absolute, the concluding chord of this story that should not have had an end. Nothing changed, but everything became different, irreversibly changed by the absence. The world continued to turn, but for this island time froze in December. The mystery hung in the air, unsolvable and eternal, like death itself. The sea carried the answer to the bottom, where there is no light or sound, where there is no time. Only assumption remained, guesswork, fear passed from mouth to mouth. The morning of the 14th of December became the end of an era for this lighthouse and its keepers. Light no longer ignited with the same confidence, shadow fell upon the ocean. Ships avoided this place, fearing ghosts. The secret remained unrevealed, kept in the depths of ages. The rescue ship arrived a week later, cutting through the smooth surface of the calm sea, which seemed too serene for a place of such inexplicable and gruesome tragedy. The ship's captain, a man who had seen much on northern routes, felt a cold horror when the island emerged from the fog like a black stain on the water. The silence around was absolute, no cry of gulls, no splash of waves, only the hum of the engine disturbed the dead calm of the ocean. The lighthouse stood alone, its white column contrasting with the grey sky, like a finger pointing to the heavens in a silent plea for help. The crew prepared for the worst, expecting to see bodies or signs of struggle on the rocks, but reality turned out to be far more sinister in its emptiness. The boat touched the stones, and the sailors stepped onto land that seemed cursed by nature itself and forgotten by God. The air here was heavy, saturated with the smell of salt and something ancient that defied description in human language. They walked toward the door, knowing that no life awaited behind it, but not suspecting what truth awaited them inside. The captain found the lighthouse empty, food on the table, and the logbook with final entries speaking of invisible horror frozen in ink forever. The pages were filled by a hand that was losing its mind with each line, turning into scribbles of madness and despair. He read about a storm that never came, about shadows crawling along the walls, and about the voice of the sea calling their names in the night silence. Cold penetrated beneath the captain's clothes when he realized these words were not delirium, but an account of an encounter with something incomprehensible to the human mind. The cup stood untouched, the tea had cooled several days before, turning into black sludge at the bottom of the porcelain. Time here had stopped at the moment of catastrophe, preserving the last moment of 3 men's lives in the amber of everyday life. No signs of violence, no bloodstains, only disappearance, complete and final, as if they had been erased from reality. It seemed they had evaporated, leaving behind only the shell of their daily life and a mystery. But the true secret was revealed later when divers examined the base of the rock, immersing themselves in the icy water around the island in heavy suits. They searched for bodies, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened, some clue for the official investigation. However, instead of bodies, they discovered something that made them tremble even in the warm cabins of the ship after long immersion. There, at a height of 20 meters above sea level, where waves never reached even in the strongest storm, they found deep grooves. The stone was hard as iron, but someone or something had left claw marks on it, deep and long, dug into the granite. This was physical proof that something enormous had climbed the vertical wall, violating the laws of gravity and physics for its purpose. And the most terrible thing was not that they had disappeared, but that in the pocket of MacArthur's jacket, found later nailed to the rock on a neighboring island, lay a note. The fabric was soaked with salt and water, but the paper inside remained dry, as if protected by an invisible force from destruction. The note was written in Duckett's hand, his handwriting firm and clear, as it had not been for many days before the disappearance. It said that they had not left, but had been chosen, and that the sea demanded payment for the light they gave to the world. The words sounded like a verdict issued by an ancient force that did not recognize human lives and values. They had become victims of a pact that no one knew about, the price for the safety of ships in these dangerous waters. The lighthouse light was not just a signal, but a beacon for something else, living in the depths and demanding tribute. This discovery was classified, reports were altered to avoid spreading panic among sailors and residents of the British coast. The official version spoke of an accident and a rogue wave, but those who read the originals knew the truth about the sacrifice. The sea did not just take them, it accepted them as tribute, as a necessary sacrifice to maintain the balance of the elements. The lighthouse continued to work, new keepers took their places, but none of them stayed there long without reason. They felt the gaze from the water, heard footsteps on the gallery on calm nights when there was no wind at all. The legend of the disappeared keepers became a warning for those who looked too long into the darkness of the ocean and saw a gaze looking back. The mystery of the Flannan Isles remained unsolved for the general public, hidden behind a layer of official lies and silences. The ocean keeps its secrets better than any grave, hiding truths in its oxygen-free depths forever from human eyes. 3 men became part of the landscape, their memory dissolved in the roar of the surf and the creak of stones under tourists' feet. But sometimes, on very quiet nights when the wind subsides and the water becomes a black mirror, local fishermen cross themselves in their boats. They know that the lighthouse light sometimes flickers not as it should, as if someone closed the lens with a hand from inside the tower. The sea demands payment, and the bill is never fully paid, only postponed until the next time hunger awakens. The story ended, but the horror remained alive in the waters around the island, awaiting new keepers for its eternal and insatiable hunger. Darkness always waits for its hour to cover the earth again with its heavy blanket and take new souls. The consequences of this story extended far beyond simple disappearance, becoming part of the folklore and nightmares of future generations of sailors. Books were written, films were made, but no work could convey the cold that blows from these rocks. Everyone who heard this story began to look differently at the dark water, seeing in it not just an element, but a living creature. The lighthouse was automated years later. People were removed from the equation so that no one else would become payment for the light. But automation cannot feel fear, cannot read signs, and cannot become a victim in the same sense. Ancient forces adapt, they find new paths when old ones are closed by iron doors and technologies. The entity in the water did not leave, it simply waits for technology to fail so it can demand its share again. Today the island remains uninhabited, nature slowly reclaims the territory wrested from the elements by humans. Grass breaks through cracks in the concrete, birds build nests where people once walked. But local residents avoid approaching close to the water on certain days of the year when the tide is especially high. They say that on these days the sea becomes black as oil and stops reflecting the light of the moon. This is a sign that the ancient pact is still in force, and the memory of the three keepers lives in the depths. No one knows when the bill will be presented again, but the lighthouse stands as a reminder of the price that must be paid for safety. The light burns, but the shadow from the tower has grown longer, as if death itself casts it upon the water.